The dust swirled thick as molasses in the suffocating heat of Redemption Creek, a town that had never lived up to its name. The saloon doors creaked open and shut like the breathing of some dying beast, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden planks that served as sidewalks. It was the kind of place where hope came to die, where decent folk learned to look the other way, and where a man's worth was measured by the weight of his coin purse rather than the content of his character. Sarah May clutched her worn rag doll tighter to her chest as she watched her father stumble out of Murphy's saloon for the third time that morning. At 7 years old, she had already learned to read the signs. The way his shoulders sagged, the way his boots dragged in the dirt, the way his eyes couldn't quite meet hers when he looked in her direction. Today felt different, though. Today, there was something in his expression that made her small heart race with a fear she couldn't name. "Papa," she called softly, her voice barely audible above the constant buzz of flies and the distant sound of cattle lowing in their pens. Thomas Beckett turned toward his daughter, and for a moment, Sarah May saw a flicker of the man he used to be before the whiskey and the gambling had eaten away at his soul like acid on metal. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by that familiar hollow stare that had become as much a part of him as his weathered hands and sun-beaten face. "Come here, girl," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. Sarah May obeyed as she always did, her bare feet making small clouds of dust with each step. Her dress, once yellow as summer wheat, had faded to the color of old parchment, and it hung loose on her thin frame. She had inherited her mother's delicate features and dark hair. But where her mother had possessed an inner light that could brighten even the darkest room, Sarah May's eyes held a wariness that no child should ever have to carry. Thomas knelt down to her level, his knees cracking with the effort. Up close she could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the red veins that spider-webbed across his nose. Notice how his hands shook slightly even when he tried to keep them still. "Sarah May," he began, then stopped, as if the words he needed to say were stuck somewhere deep in his throat. "Your papa's got himself into a bit of trouble." She nodded solemnly, understanding more than he realized. She had heard the raised voices through the thin walls of their one-room shack, had seen the men who came looking for him when he thought she was asleep. She knew about the debts, about the money he owed to people who didn't accept excuses or promises of future payment. What she didn't know, couldn't have imagined, was what he was about to tell her next. "There's a man," Thomas continued, his voice growing smaller with each word. "A man who's willing to take you in, give you a home, food in your belly. He's got money, Sarah May. Real money. And he's willing to pay your papa's debts in exchange." Even at 7, Sarah May understood that something was terribly wrong with what her father was telling her. The way he couldn't look at her directly, the way his hands trembled more than usual, the way his voice caught on certain words. "I don't want to go with a stranger, Papa," she whispered. "I want to stay with you." Thomas closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "It ain't about what we want, little one. It's about what needs to be done. This man, he'll take care of you better than your old papa ever could. You'll have pretty dresses, good food, maybe even learn to read proper." But Sarah May shook her head, her dark hair whipping around her face. "I don't care about pretty dresses. I just want to be with you." She threw her small arms around his neck, holding on as tightly as she could, as if her grip alone could keep them together forever. From across the street, a tall figure watched this heartbreaking scene unfold. James Roosevelt had ridden into Redemption Creek that morning with nothing more than a desire to water his horse and perhaps grab a hot meal before continuing his journey west. He was a man of few words and fewer friends, someone who had learned long ago that the world could be a cruel and unforgiving place. His own childhood had been marked by hardship and loss, and he had grown into the kind of man who kept his emotions locked away behind walls of steel and silence. But there was something about the sight of that small girl clinging to her father, something about the desperation in both their faces, that stirred something deep within him. Maybe it was the memory of his own sister, taken by fever when she was not much older than this child. Maybe it was the recognition of a father's anguish, having watched his own pa struggle with demons that no amount of love could conquer. Or maybe it was simply the voice of conscience that he had tried so hard to silence over the years. James had built a reputation as a man who minded his own business, who rode through towns like a ghost and left no trace of his passing. He had money, more than most men would see in a lifetime, earned through careful investments and a keen understanding of cattle futures. But money had never brought him happiness, only a kind of cold comfort that kept the world at arm's length. He told himself he preferred it that way, that caring about people only led to pain and disappointment. Yet as he watched Thomas Becket struggle with what was clearly the most difficult decision of his life, James found himself remembering another scene from long ago. He had been perhaps 10 years old when he witnessed his own father sell their family's milk cow to pay off a gambling debt. He remembered the way his mother had cried, the way his little sister had asked where Bessie had gone, the way his father had looked like a man whose soul had been carved out with a rusty knife. The memory had haunted him for years, and now it was playing out again before his eyes with variations that made it even more heartbreaking. The stranger his father was talking about emerged from the shadows of the general store, and Sarah May's blood turned to ice in her veins. He was a large man with small, dark eyes that reminded her of the rats she sometimes saw scurrying around their shack at night. His clothes were expensive but somehow dirty-looking, as if all the money in the world couldn't wash away whatever darkness lived inside him. When he smiled at her, showing teeth stained yellow from tobacco, she instinctively pressed closer to her father. "Well now, Becket," the man said, his voice smooth as oil but with an undercurrent that made Sarah May's skin crawl. "This must be the little lady we discussed. Pretty little thing, ain't she? She'll do just fine indeed." Thomas's grip on his daughter tightened involuntarily, and for a moment, James thought he might change his mind. But then the man reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. $5 as we agreed," he said, holding the pouch just out of reach. "More money than you'll see again anytime soon, Becket. And all you got to do is sign this here paper saying you're giving me legal guardianship of the girl. $5. James felt sick to his stomach. This man was buying a child, a human being with hopes and dreams and fears, for the price of a decent horse. He looked at Sarah May's face and saw his own sister's eyes, wide with terror and confusion. He saw every child who had ever been failed by the adults who should have protected them. And in that moment, something inside him broke open like a dam that had held back a lifetime of suppressed emotion. "Excuse me," James said, stepping forward before he could think better of it. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the surface that made all three of them turn to look at him. "Couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I'm wondering if there might be another way to settle this debt." The stranger's eyes narrowed as he sized up this newcomer. James was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the open sky. His clothes were simple but well made, and there was something in his bearing that suggested he was not a man to be trifled with. "This ain't none of your concern, friend," the stranger said, his voice losing some of its oily smoothness. "This is a private business arrangement." "Is it now?" James replied, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to buy a little girl like she was a head of cattle, and that don't sit right with me." Thomas looked between the two men, confusion and hope warring in his bloodshot eyes. "Mister, you don't understand. I owe this man money, more money than I could earn in 5 years. If I don't pay him back, he'll—" Thomas stopped, glancing down at his daughter. Some threats were too terrible to voice in front of a child. James reached into his own coat and withdrew a roll of bills that made the stranger's $5 pouch look pathetic by comparison. "How much does he owe you?" he asked the man directly. $50, came the reply, though the stranger's voice had lost much of its confidence. "Plus interest, say $60 total." Without hesitation, James peeled off the bills and held them out. "Here's your $60. The debt is paid, and the girl stays with her father." But the stranger shook his head, his small eyes glittering with malice. "Oh no, it don't work that way, friend. See, I got myself a contract here, all legal and proper. The girl's father agreed to give her to me in exchange for settling his debt. Money ain't the only thing I want in this deal." The implication in his words hit James like a physical blow, and he saw red for a moment. His hand moved to his gun, but before he could draw it, Sarah May's small voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Papa, please don't let him take me," she whispered, and the heartbreak in her voice was enough to break even the hardest man's resolve. "I'll be good, I promise. I'll help you stop drinking the bad water. I'll work harder." Hush now, baby girl," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "Ain't nothing you done wrong. Your papa's the one who made the mess, and now he's got to clean it up the only way he knows how. James looked at this broken family and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Mr. Beckett, he said, his voice steadied despite the emotion churning inside him. What if I offered you a different kind of deal? What if I paid off your debt and offered you a job in the bargain? I've got a ranch about 2 days' ride from here, and I could use a man who knows his way around horses and cattle. Thomas stared at him in disbelief. Mister, you don't even know me. For all you know, I'm the worst kind of man, the kind who'd sell his own daughter for drinking money. Maybe you are, James replied quietly. But maybe you're also a man who's lost his way and needs someone to believe he can find it again. Maybe you're a father who loves his daughter enough to work harder than he's ever worked in his life to become the man she deserves. The stranger had heard enough. This is ridiculous, he snarled, stepping toward Sarah May. A deal's a deal, and I intend to collect what's mine. He reached for the little girl, but James moved faster than anyone expected. In one fluid motion, he stepped between them, his hand now resting openly on his gun. The only thing that's going to be collected here today is your teeth if you take one more step toward that child, James said, his voice deadly quiet. The stranger looked into his eyes and saw something that made him take an involuntary step backward. This was not a man who made idle threats. You can't do this. The stranger protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I got a legal contract. Let me see this contract, James said, holding out his hand, reluctantly. The man produced a crumpled piece of paper that was more dirt than parchment. James took one look at it and shook his head. This isn't worth the paper it's written on. No judge in the territory would recognize a contract that trades a child for money. Matter of fact, I'd say what you're trying to do here is illegal in about 12 different ways. The truth was that in a lawless town like Redemption Creek, the stranger might well have gotten away with his plan. But James's confidence and obvious resources made him reconsider the wisdom of pushing the matter further. He looked around and noticed that their conversation had begun to attract attention from other townspeople, and not all of the faces looking his way were friendly. This ain't over, the stranger muttered, but he was already backing away. I know people, important people. You mess with me, you'll regret it. I'm sure you do, James replied calmly, but right now, you need to get out of my sight before I decide to show you what regret really looks like. The stranger hesitated for one more moment, then turned and stalked away, disappearing into the crowd like the rat he was. James watched him go, then turned back to Thomas and Sarah May, who were staring at him as if he had just descended from heaven on golden wings. Why? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you help us? You don't know us from Adam. James looked down at Sarah May, who was peering up at him with eyes that were no longer quite so frightened. Maybe because everyone deserves a second chance, he said simply. Maybe because I believe there's still good in this world, even when it's hard to see. Or maybe because I once knew a little girl who reminded me of your daughter, and I couldn't save her when she needed saving. He knelt down to Sarah May's level, just as her father had done earlier. What's your name, little one? Sarah May Beckett, she replied, her voice still small but no longer trembling. Well, Sarah May Beckett, my name is James Roosevelt, and I'd like to offer you and your papa a chance to start over. My ranch has got a big house with lots of rooms, and I could use some help taking care of all the horses and cattle. Your papa could work for me, earn honest money, and you could go to school in the nearest town. What do you think about that? Sarah May looked up at her father, then back at James. Would Papa have to drink the bad water anymore? The question hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He realized that his daughter had been watching him destroy himself, had been trying to make sense of why her father chose a bottle over his own child's well-being. The shame was overwhelming, but beneath it, he felt something else stirring, something that might have been hope. No, baby girl, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Papa's done with the bad water. If Mr. Roosevelt here is willing to give us this chance, then I swear to you on your mama's grave that I'll never touch another drop. James stood up and extended his hand to Thomas. It won't be easy, he warned. The first few weeks especially are going to test every bit of strength you have. But if you're willing to try, really try, then I'm willing to help. Thomas looked at that outstretched hand for a long moment, seeing in it everything he had lost and everything he might yet gain. When he finally took it, his grip was firm despite the tremor in his fingers. Mr. Roosevelt, I don't know how to thank you. "Don't thank me yet," James replied. "Thank me when you've proven to yourself and to your daughter that you're the man I think you can be." The journey to James's ranch took 3 days instead of 2, partly because they had to travel at a pace that wouldn't tire Sarah May, and partly because Thomas was already beginning to experience the first symptoms of withdrawal from alcohol. James watched him struggle with a mixture of sympathy and determination, remembering his own father's battles with similar demons. On the second night, as they sat around their small campfire under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, Sarah May fell asleep curled up against her father's side. Thomas stroked her hair gently, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "I almost lost her today," he said quietly, not looking at James. "I almost sold my own daughter like she was property." "What kind of man does that make me?" "It makes you a man who was desperate and scared," James replied. "It makes you human. The question now is what kind of man you choose to be from here on out." Thomas was quiet for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and feeling the steady rhythm of his daughter's breathing against his side. "She's all I got left of her mother," he finally said. "Mary was the best woman who ever lived, and she died bringing this little angel into the world. I promised her as she lay dying that I'd take care of Sarah May, that I'd be the father our daughter deserved. Instead, I've been drowning myself in whiskey and self-pity for 7 years. Grief can make us do terrible things," James said softly. "I know something about that myself. But Mary didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life punishing yourself. She died giving life to that little girl sleeping against your heart. The best way to honor her memory is to be the father Sarah May needs." The next morning brought new challenges as Thomas's withdrawal symptoms intensified. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his coffee cup, and waves of nausea left him pale and sweating. But every time he looked at Sarah May, who stayed close by his side with unwavering loyalty, he found the strength to keep going. James had seen men go through this process before, and he knew that the next few weeks would be crucial. Some men broke under the strain and went back to drinking. Others found an inner strength they never knew they possessed. Everything would depend on Thomas's will to change and his love for his daughter. When they finally reached the Roosevelt Ranch, Sarah May's eyes went wide with wonder. She had never seen anything like it in her short life. The main house was built of sturdy timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that seemed to welcome visitors. There were corrals filled with beautiful horses, pastures dotted with cattle, and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. "This is all yours," she asked James, her voice filled with awe. "It's home," he replied simply, "and now it's your home too, for as long as you and your papa want to stay." The first few weeks were indeed as difficult as James had predicted. Thomas went through periods of severe shaking, nightmares that left him screaming in the night, and moments of despair so deep that James wondered if the man would survive them. But Sarah May never left his side, holding his hand when the shaking got bad, singing softly to him when the nightmares came, and reminding him every day why he was fighting so hard to get better. James found himself drawn into their little family circle despite his initial intention to maintain his distance. He helped Sarah May learn to read, using old books from his extensive library. He taught her to ride on a gentle mare named Buttercup, delighting in her squeals of joy and excitement, and slowly, as Thomas began to recover his strength and sobriety, James began to teach him the ins and outs of running a ranch. Thomas proved to be a natural horseman, with an intuitive understanding of cattle and a work ethic that impressed even James. As the weeks turned into months, the hollow-eyed, shaking man who had nearly sold his daughter for $5 transformed into someone entirely different. His shoulders straightened, his eyes cleared, and most importantly, he began to smile again when he looked at Sarah May. The little girl flourished in ways that amazed all of them. With regular meals and a stable home, she grew taller and stronger. Her natural intelligence, nurtured by James's patient teaching, blossomed like a flower that had finally found sunlight. She learned to read with remarkable speed, devouring every book James put in front of her. She helped in the kitchen, tended a small garden, and made friends with every animal on the ranch. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in James himself. He had lived alone for so many years that he had forgotten what it felt like to be part of a family. Sarah May's laughter filled the quiet corners of his house, and Thomas's steady presence gave him someone to share the daily challenges and victories of ranch life. For the first time in decades, James Roosevelt was no longer lonely. One evening, nearly 6 months after that fateful day in Redemption Creek, the three of them sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah May was curled up in James's lap, reading aloud from a book of poetry while Thomas worked on repairing a bridle with hands that were now steady and sure. "Mr. James," Sarah May said, looking up from her book, "are you ever going to get married and have children of your own?" James felt his cheeks redden slightly at the unexpected question. "I don't know, little one. I suppose I never really thought much about it." "Well, you should," she said with the confidence that only children possess. "You'd make a wonderful papa. You've been like a papa to me, and I think any little girl would be lucky to have you." Thomas looked up from his work, his eyes meeting James's across the porch. "She's right, you know. You saved both of us that day, gave us a life we never could have imagined, but maybe we've given you something too." James considered this, watching as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. He thought about the man he had been before that day in Redemption Creek, closed off from the world, convinced that caring about people only led to pain. Now he couldn't imagine his life without these two precious souls who had somehow become his family. "Maybe you have," he admitted quietly. "Maybe you've given me more than you know." As the months continued to pass, their unconventional family grew stronger and happier. Thomas proved himself to be not just a capable ranch hand, but a valuable partner in running the operation. His ideas for improving their cattle breeding program increased their profits significantly, and his gentle way with the horses made him indispensable during the breaking and training process. Sarah May continued to blossom, growing not just in size but in confidence and intelligence. James arranged for a retired school teacher from the nearest town to come to the ranch twice a week, ensuring that Sarah May received a proper education. Her quick mind and eager curiosity impressed everyone who met her, and James began to dream of sending her to a real school, perhaps even college someday. The three of them developed rhythms and traditions that bound them together as surely as blood ties. Saturday evenings were for storytelling, with each of them taking turns spinning tales that grew more elaborate and ridiculous with each telling. Sunday mornings meant pancakes and bacon cooked over the big kitchen stove, followed by long rides through the countryside. And every evening, no matter how busy the day had been, they gathered on the front porch to watch the sunset and share the events of their day. It was during one of these evening sessions, as autumn began to paint the leaves in brilliant shades of red and gold, that an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch. A woman stepped down from a dusty stagecoach, elegant and well-dressed, with kind eyes and graying hair. She introduced herself as Mrs. Margaret Whitman, and she had traveled all the way from St. Louis with a purpose that would test the bonds of their newly formed family. "Mr. Roosevelt," she said, accepting the chair James offered her on the porch. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I've come a very long way to speak with you about Sarah May." The little girl looked up from her book, suddenly alert to the tension in the adults around her. Thomas set down his work and moved protectively closer to his daughter, while James felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. "I'm Sarah May's great-aunt," Mrs. Whitman continued, her voice gentle but determined. "My late sister Mary was her mother. I've only recently learned of Mary's death and the existence of my great-niece. I've come to take Sarah May back to St. Louis with me, where she belongs." The words hit the porch like a thunderclap, shattering the peaceful evening calm. Sarah May's face went white, and she instinctively reached for her father's hand. Thomas's jaw tightened, and James felt something cold and fierce rise up inside him. "With all due respect, Ma'am," James said carefully, "Sarah May belongs here with her father and with us. We're her family now." Whitman's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "I can see how much you all care for her, and I'm grateful for the kindness you've shown. But surely you understand that a little girl needs more than a remote ranch can provide. In St. Louis, she would have access to the finest schools, cultural opportunities, the chance to become a proper young lady. I can give her advantages that simply aren't available out here in the wilderness." "And what about her father?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "What about the fact that she's my daughter, my flesh and blood?" Mrs. Whitman turned to look at him, and Thomas saw pity in her eyes that cut him deeper than contempt would have. "Mr. Beckett, I've made inquiries about your circumstances. I know about your difficulties with alcohol, about the situation these good people rescued you from. Can you honestly say that you're the best choice to raise my great niece?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Thomas felt all his old insecurities and self-doubts come rushing back. The man who had nearly sold his daughter for $5 seemed to rise up from the depths of his memory, reminding him of every failure, every moment of weakness, every time he had chosen whiskey over his child's well-being. But then he felt a small hand slip into his, and he looked down to see Sarah May gazing up at him with absolute trust and love shining in her eyes. In that moment, he saw not his failures but his redemption, not what he had been but what he had become. The strength that had carried him through months of sobriety and hard work filled him now with quiet determination. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I won't pretend I ain't made mistakes. I won't pretend that there was a time when I was everything a father shouldn't be. But that man is gone, buried under months of hard work and the love of this little girl. I am her father, and she belongs with me." Sarah May squeezed his hand tighter and found her own voice. "I don't want to go to St. Louis," she said, her words clear despite the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. "I want to stay here with Papa and Mr. James. This is my home." Mrs. Whitman studied the three faces before her, seeing the genuine love and loyalty that bound them together. She had expected to find a rough frontier situation that would make her case for taking Sarah May easy to argue. Instead, she found a family unit that, while unconventional, was clearly built on solid foundations of love and mutual support. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we could reach some sort of compromise. What if Sarah May could spend part of each year with me in St. Louis? She could attend school there during the winter months and return here for the summers. That way, she would have the best of both worlds." James was the first to respond, surprising everyone, including himself. "That might not be such a bad idea," he said thoughtfully. "Sarah May is too smart and too special to be limited by what we can offer her out here. If she had access to better schools, music lessons, art classes, all the things that a proper education includes, she could become anything she wanted to be." Thomas felt his heart sink. Was James already tired of their makeshift family? Was he ready to see Sarah May go? But when he looked at his friend and benefactor, he saw not rejection but the kind of love that puts a child's needs above personal desires. "You think she should go?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think she should have choices," James replied gently. "I think she should have every opportunity to develop all the gifts she was born with. And I think we love her enough to make sure she gets those opportunities, even if it means sharing her with someone else." The discussion continued long into the evening, with Mrs. Whitman sharing more about her life in St. Louis and her hopes for Sarah May's future. She was a widow with grown children of her own, financially comfortable, and genuinely committed to providing Sarah May with the best possible education and opportunities. As the night wore on, it became clear that her offer came from love rather than duty, and that she truly wanted what was best for her great niece. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, they reached an agreement. Sarah May would spend the school months with Mrs. Whitman in St. Louis, receiving a proper education and exposure to cultural opportunities she could never find on the ranch. But she would return every summer to the ranch that had become her true home, to the father who had fought so hard to become worthy of her love, and to the man who had saved them both. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation as Mrs. Whitman extended her stay to help Sarah May get ready for her new adventure. James took the little girl shopping in the nearest town, buying her a wardrobe suitable for city life. Thomas spent hours talking with his daughter, reassuring her that this separation was temporary and that he would be waiting for her when she returned. On the morning of their departure, the entire ranch seemed subdued. The horses in the corrals stood quietly, as if they too sensed that something important was happening. James stood on the front porch, watching as Thomas helped Sarah May climb into Mrs. Whitman's carriage, and felt his heart break a little at the sight. "Pop," Sarah May said, throwing her arms around Thomas's neck one last time. "You promise you'll be here when I come back? You promise you won't drink the bad water while I'm gone?" "I promise, baby girl," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You're taking my heart with you to St. Louis, so I gotta make sure I'm here and worthy when you bring it back home." She hugged James just as fiercely, burying her face against his chest. "Thank you for saving us," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me a papa I can be proud of and a home where I belong." "Thank you for saving me right back," James whispered into her hair. Thank you for showing me what family really means." As the carriage rolled away, raising a cloud of dust that slowly settled back to earth, James and Thomas stood side by side, watching until it disappeared over the horizon. The ranch felt emptier without Sarah May's laughter echoing through the buildings, but it wasn't the crushing emptiness of loss. Instead, it was the productive emptiness of farmers who had planted good seed and were waiting for the harvest. The months passed more quickly than either man expected. Letters arrived regularly from St. Louis, filled with Sarah May's excitement about her new school, her music lessons, the museums and libraries that opened up whole new worlds of knowledge. But every letter also contained assurances that she missed the ranch, that she dreamed about riding Buttercup across the prairie, that she was counting the days until summer. Thomas threw himself into his work with renewed energy, driven by the desire to have something wonderful to show his daughter when she returned. He and James expanded the ranch's operations, adding new breeding programs and improving their facilities. Thomas proved to be not just a hard worker, but an innovative thinker, coming up with ideas that increased their efficiency and profitability. James watched his friend's transformation with quiet satisfaction. The broken man who had nearly sold his daughter for drinking money had become a respected rancher, a valuable partner, and most importantly, a father that any child would be proud to claim. The demons that had once driven him to drink seemed to have been exorcised by hard work, purpose, and the knowledge that Sarah May was depending on him. When spring finally arrived and the time approached for Sarah May's return, both men found themselves as excited as schoolboys. They painted the house, planted flower gardens, and even bought a new piano so that Sarah May could practice the music she was learning in St. Louis. Everything had to be perfect for their little girl's homecoming. The day she arrived, stepping down from the stagecoach like a young lady, but running toward them like the child she still was, James and Thomas felt their world become complete again. She had grown during her months away, not just in height but in confidence and sophistication. Her speech had acquired a slight refinement that spoke of her education, but her eyes still held the same love and loyalty that had bound their unusual family together. That first evening back on the ranch, as they sat on the familiar front porch watching the familiar sunset, Sarah May regaled them with stories of her adventures in St. Louis. She told them about the grand library with more books than she could read in a lifetime, about the symphony orchestra that made music so beautiful it brought tears to her eyes, about the art museum where she spent hours studying paintings from around the world. But then she grew quiet, looking out over the rolling prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "It was all wonderful," she said softly, "and I learned so much. But this is still home. This will always be home." The pattern continued for several years. Each fall, Sarah May would travel to St. Louis for her education, returning each summer to the ranch that held her heart. She excelled in her studies, showing particular aptitude for literature and music. Her great-aunt reported that she was becoming a refined young lady, but one who never forgot her roots, or the people who had shaped her character. Thomas continued to grow in strength and wisdom, his reputation as a horseman and cattleman spreading throughout the territory. He never touched alcohol again, finding his strength in the love of his daughter and the respect of his peers. The man who had once been willing to trade his child for $5 became someone that others looked up to, someone whose word was his bond and whose character was beyond reproach. James, too, found that his life had been irrevocably changed by that chance encounter in Redemption Creek. The lonely, bitter man who had ridden into that dusty town had been replaced by someone who understood the true meaning of family and community. He became a respected member of the local business community, using his resources not just for personal gain, but to help others who found themselves in desperate circumstances. On Sarah May's 18th birthday, as she prepared for her final year of school in St. Louis, the three of them sat once again on the front porch, where they had shared so many important conversations. She was no longer the frightened little girl in the fade,